Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Ideas 42 Academy Seminar Series. I'm Mitra Salosel, Director of Communications at Ideas 42, and on behalf of all of us, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. I'm particularly excited about our program today as we're doing something a little bit different than our standard lecture series. I'm pleased to introduce a special conversation between Josh Wright and Yale professor Zoe Chance to discuss Zoe's new book about a topic that I think will resonate with all of us. Influence is your superpower. Josh Wright is the executive director at Ideas 42, and during his decade leading our organization, he's overseen our work applying behavioral science to an ever-growing number of pathways for social change. And Zoe Chance is a professor of marketing at the Yale School of Management, an Ideas 42 academic affiliate, and an esteemed researcher focusing on persuasion. Influence is your superpower. The reason we're gathered virtually here today is her most recent publication. Before I hand it over to Josh and Zoe for what I'm sure will be an engaging conversation, a brief housekeeping note, especially for those of you who may be new to the Ideas 42 seminar series format. We'll be including time for audience questions at the end of the Q&A, but we'll take them via the Zoom Q&A box. So as you have those questions, if they pop up during the program or at the end of the program, go ahead and drop them into the box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll share them with Zoe and Josh in the last 10 minutes of the hour. All right, I think that's everything. Without further ado, over to you, Josh.
Thanks so much, Mitra. Great to be here with you, Zoe. Super excited to talk about the book today. I've read easily 100 popular books about behavioral science, and I have to say this is one of my favorite books. And it's the only book I've bought for both my 18-year-old daughter and my 15-year-old son, and I will buy for my 9-year-old daughter when she's a little bit older.
That's the most amazing compliment. Thank you, Josh.
Well, the reason I really love this book is that a couple. One is that it has amazing, I think, real-world life lessons for us based on real behavioral science about how to operate in the world. But the other reason I'm super excited about it is because I think the book is sort of meta. I think in behavioral science, we've done an amazing job at designing better interventions and programs that really help people. And we perhaps haven't done as good a job convincing other people how to use those programs and use all the ideas of behavioral science. So that's one of the things that I'm super excited about, is that I think this book actually uses behavioral science to help us use behavioral science to influence people. So that is awesome. I do want to say one little caveat. I'm a graduate of the Yale School of Management, although I was there before Zoe's time, and I just have to admit I'm biased to all things SOM. So super excited to be here with you, Zoe.
We're proud of you, Josh.
Oh, thank you. Why don't we kick it off with the first question?
Can I just say thank you so much for the meta recognition and frame that you just offered. And that was one of my biggest challenges while I was writing this book, because I'm writing about what it takes to be persuasive with full knowledge that I need to be walking the talk if this is going to succeed at all. And many of the principles that I'm writing about in the book, which a lot of the ideas of influence and persuasion have to do with engaging and re-engaging attention. So to be trying to do that at the same time as getting the messages out is a big challenge. And so if it worked for you and your kids, I'm very excited.
I mean, it's the other thing I didn't say is we're giving it to everyone who works at Ideas 42. And it's going to be one of the, we only give people 3 books when they start at Ideas 42. One is Nudge, the other is Thinking Fast and Slow, and then Scarcity. And this is going to be the 4th book that we give people. Really, because that aspect of, it is so important, not only that we do a great job of behavioral science, but we convince other people and use that to influence other people like policymakers about the great ideas of behavioral science. So why don't I get in?
That is now the second best compliment that this book has received. So your kids is the first best compliment, but to be there along with those books that you just mentioned is the second best compliment that this book has gotten. So thank you.
It's well deserved. So there are many popular books about different aspects of behavioral science that have come into the mainstream. What made you choose to write this book about influence, and why now?
So the why now part is the easiest part. It took me 5 years, and that's just how long it took. But the why influence, this is the topic that I've been obsessed with for a long time. And I've been teaching a course at Yale that's called Mastering Influence and Persuasion since I joined the business school, I guess a decade ago. And this class is the most popular class at SOM. And I would like to take full credit for it, but I can't really, because it was standing room only the very first day that I started, because people were so eager for the ability to be more influential and more persuasive. And the kinds of things that students have done throughout the course of this time that I've been teaching, and also executives who come through my workshops, have been so inspirational to me and to the rest of us. But we have this little community that's so beautiful, and it's so Ivy League, right? And I think we really are grounded in a lot of ways at SOM in the real world with our mission to serve both business and society. And I hope that you felt like that when you were at SOM. But still, we're just this small community of privileged people. So I wanted to share these ideas and insights and practices that have been appealing here with people who didn't have to or couldn't come to Yale, or they were just busy with other stuff.
Well, that's awesome. So one of the many things I like about the book is that you use behavioral science to make the book memorable and sticky. And one of the specific examples of that is the gator and the judge. And I've heard a lot of versions of System 1 and System 2, or anecdotes or ways to make it memorable. But I think this one is particularly sticky. And I'm just sort of curious where that came from and why you think it, from a behavioral science perspective, works so well and is so sticky and memorable.
So for people who are listening, I think the majority of you will be familiar with System 1 and System 2. So I'm not going to explain it. And we could just very, very shorthand it, saying thinking versus feeling, although it's a lot more complex than that. But when you have this foundational theory of behavioral economics that has a specific name, System 1 and System 2, you have to be either really arrogant or really careful to choose to rename this foundational framework in your own discipline. And I hope that I was really careful rather than really arrogant. What happened was I was teaching behavioral economics, including to not just people who are new to it, but people who are excited about behavioral science and had traveled from all over to Yale to do a multi-day boot camp with us on behavioral economics. Even those people who knew about System 1 and System 2, and then even PhD students who know about System 1 and System 2 kept mixing up the names because it's just not sticky. And the whole idea, so most people, even in behavioral economics, don't understand, because they haven't been taught, the reason for the names System 1 and System 2 to be so abstract is that's actually the point, because they were designed to take into account all of the dual processes, like thinking versus feeling is one, right brain versus left brain, reason versus emotions, and many other ones that had come up. System 1 and System 2 said, actually, there are these two grand systems that differ in these predictable ways from each other. But because they had to be so abstract, it was just really hard to remember. So I chose the gator and the judge after considering Jonathan Haidt's elephant versus rider framework that was already out there. First of all, I'm very passionate about wildlife and animal rights, and it's terrible to ride elephants. Nobody should ever do it. So even having the metaphor of riding an elephant was painful to me. People break their backs. It's really bad. But more importantly, even than that, is that misrepresented how these two systems interact, and it made it seem as though System 2 controls System 1, but it's very much the reverse. And even our brain anatomy, as it represents, but it's not just represent, it's our brain anatomy works in this way where we have many, many, many more neurons connecting the primitive regions of the brain, the limbic system, with the reasoning parts of our brain, like the prefrontal cortex. We have many more neurons going that direction than going in the opposite direction. And this is why a lot of the reasoning that we do is really rationalizing. So I chose a gator for System 1 because it's this primitive and very, very efficient creature. And one of the key aspects of system one from a behavioral perspective that a lot of people don't really talk about it or think about it is that you can call it efficient, but it's really very lazy. And alligators are one of the laziest creatures in the world. And hardly anybody knows, unless they've been to Gatorland in Orlando, Florida, and that you should all go if you haven't, because it's amazing. It's the alligator capital of the world, and they have 3,000 alligators there. But most people don't know that alligators can go up to 3 years without eating anything at all. And this is like our dominant response to all of these influence attempts in the world is nothing. So mostly we're super lazy and we ignore everything. And I chose, so that's the gator. Main feature of it is that it's super lazy and efficient. The judge I chose because, like a human judge, it's system 2 is trying to be rational, and it's very deliberate, and it takes a lot of effort, and it's trying to use reason, but like a human judge, it's biased, and it's biased primarily by system 1. So the stickiness, I think, is just because we can visualize it. And this is a key feature of system 1. So the very shorthand way of saying that would be the gator and the judge is the system 1 way of saying system 1 and system 2.
Yeah, I love it. I love also that you emphasize the efficiency of the gator, because I think we often forget, like, system 1 is there and gets us through the day in these amazing ways, right? Like, I often say that if you had to make and contemplate every single decision you need to make in your life, you'd never get out of the house in the morning, right? Like, system 1 is actually so helpful in that way, even though we often, I think, in behavioral science, think about criticizing it or it being the source of many of our problems as humans. So I love it.
It's underappreciated.
Yeah. So one of the lessons, so there's many lessons in here, but one of my favorite lessons in the book is about just asking, right? And that, and I find this so often as people get more kind of senior and experienced in their work, as they become salespeople or seller of ideas, even if it's not seller of products, as they do business development, or in the nonprofit world, they raise money from foundations, however you want to think about it, that it's really hard for them to get over this just asking. And I think you point this out so well in the book. Like, we have this weird mental model that if people want to say no, but then we ourselves say yes to almost everything, right? And so I just would love for you to talk a little bit more about this. I was wondering about, is there some connection to similar to loss aversion, right? Like, we feel the pain of a rejection way more than we get benefit from the affirmation of a yes. So could you just talk about, like, do you think, is there science that sort of shows that's true? And what is the driver of this sort of weird mental model about sort of how everyone else is versus how we are, and asking, not asking because we think we're going to get a no?
Yeah. And thank you, Josh, for pointing out this fact of life, which is just not noticed or discussed very often, that as you rise up in an organization, you have to do a lot more asking, and your job increasingly looks like sales, whether it's fundraising or selling ideas or actually doing deals and selling things. That the job of interpersonal influence is the job of leadership. And it's crazy that people don't get trained in this stuff, like even in high school. So I'm glad that you're giving this to your kids. This difference between how great it feels to get what we want and have people say yes versus how terrible it feels when we have people say no is, I think, shown most keenly by neuroscience research looking at the pain of rejection. And Naomi Eisenberger is one of the primary researchers on this, where she scans people's brains while they're facing social rejection. And social rejection has been used as not even something that's tested in stress research, but something that's used as the manipulation in stress research, because experiencing social rejection is so stressful. And in social science studies, they'll do things like make people give a presentation in front without any notes and very little notice in front of a room of judges who are scowling. And that's they're just trying to test what happens to your body or your mind under stress. So Naomi Eisenberger stresses people out with rejection while they're in an fMRI machine, and they're playing this three-way game of catch that turns into a game of keep away. And the two other people have sort of, maybe they've monkey in the middle to you, but they're completely ignoring you. And they're just tossing the ball back and forth to each other. And if you see the visuals, it's so primitive, this video game. It's just basically these stick figures. And you're just watching these two stick figures tossing a ball, but you don't get the ball anymore. And a rejection as simple as this from people you perceive to be utter strangers, and they're really just stick figure avatars, it's so painful that your brain processes it the same way that it processes physical pain. Now, that's the actual science of it. My interpretation of that is an evolutionary one, but many of your listeners will know that one of the big features and flaws of evolutionary psychology is that it can't be proved, it can only be discussed. But I think that it makes a lot of sense to think about the perspective that if your brain is trying to train you with sensations of pain to not do things, it makes a lot of sense that your brain would be trying to tell you to not get rejected, because facing rejection literally could mean death. And in fact, even now, like if nobody's willing to talk to you, it's very, very hard to survive. But certainly when we're back on the savannah, it would be very, very hard to survive. And then prospect theory, I think, does explain just very simply how anything that we get, it just doesn't feel as valuable as anything that we lose. And you know already the overall magnitude is about twice as much. Mm-hmm. So we have to, this is important for influence, not just when we're on the getting and receiving side, but when we're on the asking side. This is at least as important, that the other person is going to perceive that they're going to give something up. And maybe you think that you're offering them a good deal, but they're going to have to give up their time, their attention, could be their social capital, could be that they feel like they're giving up their autonomy or their freedom. And they're going to have to think that what they're getting is at least twice as good as whatever that thing is that you're offering. Mm-hmm. And Josh, the just ask thing is so funny because it's so simple. And it's embarrassing to be a Yale professor and you teach this 7-week boot camp class and you give all these science, all these challenges. And then at the end of the class, people come up in front of the room and they say the biggest, best thing that they learned. And the modal answer is just ask. So we don't realize how hard it is and how much we're not doing it until we start actively trying to practice it.
One of the things I often say to people as we try to get them to learn more about how to ask and do business development is thinking about like what success looks like, right? So like rejection is not, it's not yes or no. It's actually a win. It's a yes if you get to have another conversation, right? So like if you're doing sales, it's not, no, the person never wants to talk to you again. It's just that like maybe not right now. So I'm wondering if there's other ways, you know, off the top of your head or from the book that you think about that we can help people get over this real barrier around ask, you know, to break that mental model.
Yeah, 2 specific things. One of them is to practice trying to get rejected. And when you try to get rejected, this is sort of an Aikido move on yourself, because if you get rejected, you win. And if you fail to get rejected, but you got the thing you wanted, you also win. So you can't feel that pain of getting rejection, at least not as keenly. But the other thing that is weird, but very, very helpful to practice asking and getting rejected is to actually practice saying no. And in fact, in the class that I teach, the very first challenge is 24 hours of no, where you practice saying no to everyone who asks you for something during that 24-hour period. You don't have to say no to every single thing. So like, let's say you have a close coworker or a roommate or something like that. You don't have to keep saying no, but say no to the first thing that each person asks you for, so that you experience, how did you feel? How did they react? You find out that they don't hate you. They don't kill you. They're totally fine. And you're the boss of you, so you can change your mind, of course, afterward if you wanted to. And, you know, everyone who's listening, don't ruin your life. But what happens as you practice getting more comfortable saying no is that you start to internalize the idea that other people saying no to you is really not about you. And as you get more comfortable with them saying no, by practicing getting rejected and by practicing saying no yourself, you become more comfortable asking. Mm-hmm. And then there's this magic where your requests lose this edge of neediness that can be repulsive. Mm-hmm. And that's part of the fear that prevents us from asking, that we don't want to approach with this needy kind of edge.
Great. So I want to switch topics a little bit within the book. So
Josh, actually, before we switch, can I just ask you, because you do a lot of asking and you brought this up, is there some area of your life that you're less comfortable asking than other areas? Because I know you're a pro, but most people don't feel totally comfortable asking everybody for everything.
I don't know. I'm sure there are. I think, probably one area that would be hard for me is that I grew up in my family without a lot of money. So I've come to ask people all the time for money, but it's not for myself. It's for the organization, for the mission. When I was trying to be an elected official, it was for the campaign and the issues we were working on. But I think probably asking for things that would be about money for myself, for my own needs, would be challenging. I'm fortunate that I don't have to do that a lot now in my life, but I can imagine that would be challenging. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. And I bet a lot of people listening can relate to that. There was this artist who was doing a fellowship at Yale who I talked to, who I actually rejected when she applied to my class, because this is the most oversubscribed course, and I get a lot of applications from outside SOM. And on the application, really all she said was she has a hard time trying to be influential and asking for things. And I was like, okay, well, I don't know anything about you, so no. It turned out that she was a very famous artist from Cuba who was willing to be jailed for the rights of others. And she was doing these performance art installation pieces on free speech and putting a microphone in the middle of the town square in Havana, where people would come and they would speak truth to power. And she got jailed along with a number of other people. And museums and curators and famous art world people from all over the world, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art and stuff, petitioned for her release. And they said, okay, we're going to let you out. And she said, no, I'm going to stay here until you let all the political prisoners out who you arrested along with me. And she actually got everyone released from jail. So she's so brave. She's so powerful. But she told me that when she's trying to advocate for herself, and especially when she's asking for money, she literally feels her throat close up. Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of really smart, kind people we're not embarrassed or ashamed to ask on behalf of our organization or on behalf of other people, but it feels kind of selfish or greedy when we're asking or advocating for ourselves. Yeah.
Maybe there's something to be learned there also about, because the reverse is probably true, right? There are challenging things for everybody to ask for, but there's also probably things that in your life that it's easy to ask for. Right. And so thinking about the times when, what are the things I feel comfortable asking for, and trying to port that over to the idea of how do I feel? What's the experience there? And realizing it's probably going to be the same when you ask for the things that it's difficult to ask for.
Yeah. And I think also if we can at least remind ourselves that if we're motivated by the good things that we can do for other people, that we have a mandate to take care of ourselves. And I believe that we have a mandate to create abundance so that we can have it, so that we can share it, if we want to do any kind of great stuff. And I heard a meditation teacher say recently, you can't serve from an empty cup. Mm-hmm. And I love that just visual analogy. It really struck me in my heart, that one.
Yeah. So we're starting to talk a little bit about social good. So that's going to kind of lead into this next question I wanted to get to, which is, in the book, you're pretty clear about good and evil, right? And or using these things for good and evil. And you go even so far as to talk about a whole chapter and a half on how do you use this to combat the dark arts, right? How do you combat when people are using this against you? So can you talk a little bit more about that line between influence versus manipulation and where you think it is, and what is influence versus manipulation?
Yes, and I would love to hear what you think too, because ethics are individual and subjective, and there's no one truth that I can just share and this is what science says, or this is reality. But to me, so first of all, I guess it does help to define influence. So my definition for influence is very broad, and it's anything that changes someone's thinking or behavior. And that includes persuasion, which is when we do that through communication and through words, and also manipulation, which is when we influence someone in ways that they are not aware of, with no regard for their well-being. So this is my definition. Isn't just they don't know what we're doing or how we're trying to influence them, but we may be trying to take advantage of them, or we're just trying to get their money, or sometimes people are trying to get them into bed, or whatever it is that you might be trying to get. A lot of people come to my class feeling like anything we do to try to influence someone, if they're not aware of it, it's manipulative. And this is a very difficult position to hold if you want to be influential. And that's just because most people they're not trained in influence, and they don't know how influence works. And so you're getting the skills and you're getting the tool set, like even say nudges when you learn about defaults. This is just one of the simplest ways to influence people, that whatever the default is, they're very likely to stick to it because they're really lazy, like alligators, like we talked about. But if people don't know that just deciding what the default is as a way to influence somebody, then you might feel manipulative just by choosing the default. But what do you think, Josh? And where do you personally draw the line between influence and manipulation?
Well, I have a follow-up question to this, but I think, we often say that if you ask the person after the fact about what happened, or what they ended up choosing, are they happy with it, right? Because we know people's preferences are quite inconsistent. And so, yes, you could influence them or manipulate them in the moment, and they could choose something. But then when they're looking back at it later, if they were in a cold state, or maybe system 2 is a bit more engaged, and they didn't use bias to rationalize the choice or what have you, would they still want that decision? And I think that's one of the things that we try to think about a lot, is sort of how do you help people make the choice that they would want for themselves, not the choice that we would want for them. But I think my follow-up question was, Richard Thaler has this thing of like the New York Times test, right? So like if what you were doing is on the front page of the New York Times in full fair description of it, would you feel good about that? And I think you're exactly right that there is gray area here, right? There's not an exact litmus test, but I think that rule that he has is like actually a relatively good rule of thumb. So I'm sort of also curious if there's other rules of thumb that you would suggest. If you told your grandmother about it, would she feel like it's reasonable?
I guess I feel like there are a lot of transactional sales tactics that that I find kind of manipulative, but they're not so deeply unethical that they couldn't be on the front of the New York Times. But a really, really simple one is just scarcity, right? And I mean scarcity as a tactic, not as a mindset. Like by the way, the book that you mentioned, Scarcity, by Eldar Shafir, Sendel Mullainathan, is one of my favorite books of all time. And I think it's the only book I've ever read 4 times. So anyone on this call with us who hasn't read this book, please go and do it. I was just at an event with Cass Sunstein last week where he named this as one of his very, very favorite books as well. The scarcity tactic is that you try to make something desirable by dangling it just out of reach. And often this is done through urgency, by rushing people into something. Sometimes it's done by leading them to believe that there's only a small quantity left, or making it very exclusive. And these are among the many manipulations of the gator brain, or system 1, where you've kind of short-circuited system 2 rational thinking by making the person feel they've got to decide immediately. And because system 1 gator is very fast, that's the system that we use to make immediate decisions. But it's not like you could just say, like, oh, we said that this was a today only sale, and on the front of the New York Times, like, that's not an article. A today only sale is not news, right? It's not deeply unethical, but I believe it is manipulative, because people don't realize that rushing them puts them into this very reactive system 1 gator mindset and leads them to do things that they regret. So that is a situation, though, where your example of, did they regret the thing that they did? Did they regret the thing you tried to get them to do? Actually, is that requirement is met. So there's lots of buyer remorse going along with sales.
Yeah. The book also talks a bit about charisma, and I know there's 2 myths that I grew up thinking, that you're born with charisma, and that charisma is something about, like, being extroverted or having some sort of gravitas, whatever that means, and really love to hear, those are myths. The book talks a bit about charisma. Really love to hear more about how we should really think about charisma, and how we can each think about developing our own source of charisma.
Sure. Charisma is not something that I set out to study, and it's something that I was kind of thrust into because on the application for my course, I just asked the open-ended question, what tool or skill of influence and persuasion would you most like to master? And the number 1 thing people asked for was charisma. So I had to try to figure out, what is it? How can people get more of it? And how can I teach it to them? And the situation that I've been in my whole entire life, where I was just dumbfounded and almost knocked out by someone's charisma, was when I got to go to a Prince concert. And I was actually there with Eldar Shafir, who was one of the co-authors of the book Scarcity that we mentioned. Actually, we're in this little tiny club that's co-owned by Prince in Las Vegas, Club 2121. We've waited along with everyone else for 2 hours with the lights and the music and videos. We're all getting so excited. And Prince finally walks on stage, and he stares right into my eyes. And his first line is something like, "Are we alone?" And I grab Eldar's arm and I say, "Oh my God, I'm about to faint." And then the woman next to me on the other side, total stranger, drops unconscious to the ground in a dead faint. And the paramedics come and they're putting her on a stretcher. And I'm asking them, "Oh my God, has this ever happened before?" And they say, "It's not the first time." Prince was so charismatic that he made people lose consciousness. And I felt that myself. And I guess it's like at Beatles concerts, people have talked about, apparently it happened with Bill Clinton on the campaign trail. Prince, however, was not just not born charismatic like that. He was almost anti-charismatic when he first was performing. He was a brilliant musician and he worked super hard, and he was signed by Warner Brothers. However, the concert where they came to see him was one where he was so shy and so scared that he was just gradually turning his back to the wall until he's performing with his back to the audience and he can barely speak above a whisper. So they say, "Listen, we'll sign you and you can make records, but you will never go on tour." Rick James I guess it wasn't charity. Prince had a #1 hit. It was "I Want to Be Your Lover." Rick James invites him to be the opening act on his Super Freak tour. And Prince just starts practicing these skills of charisma that Rick James was using, until by the end of the tour, Prince was very charismatic, and Rick James says that he was jealous. And what this had to do was learning how to pay attention to the audience, call and response and connecting. And when I was sure Prince looked into my eyes, I have no idea if it was my eyes or the woman next to me, or maybe he can't see any of us because the stage lights are in his face. But it's that ability to really focus your attention on another person that is the skill of charisma. And really, really simple for people who are on the call with us. Couple of things that you can do. You do not need to wear lingerie on stage or be a loud or outgoing performer. Prince was also an introvert, by the way, and a lot of professional speakers and actors are introverted. The simplest thing that you can do is just use people's names more often, right, Josh? When we use people's names, for anyone who's read Dale Carnegie, he wrote about this in, I guess it was 1938, about how another person's name is the most beautiful sound in the English language to them. But more recently, neuroscientists have found that our name has this unique neural signature that activates the self-referential parts of the brain. And this is, so you're experiencing someone's attention very keenly when they're saying your name. You feel they're paying attention to me. And this is why you can wake up from a deep sleep or hear your name from across a crowded room. Another thing you can do to be more charismatic is to ask questions, and especially to ask follow-up questions. There's really fun and interesting research by Alison Woodbrooks and some colleagues at Harvard that find that people like people more who ask them questions, and they like people even more who ask them follow-up questions. And that's in the context of professional conversations, but also they have some experiments on speed dating. And asking people questions about themselves and allowing them to talk about themselves activates their primary reward system. And there's separate neuroscience research by Diana Tamir at Princeton that I find really interesting. She finds that people will actually pay to share information about themselves. So you can learn information about other people, or you can share information about yourself. And there's silly questions like, do you like snowboarding? How do you feel about mushrooms on pizza? And people will pay to share information about themselves. So you're offering people the chance to have that. And when I said primary reward system, some people know this is the same system that gets activated through money and sex and chocolate and cocaine and all of the other good stuff. Talking about ourselves does that. So asking questions, using people's names, and you can also write about just try reducing diminishers in your language. And these are all of the things that we say to hedge. So this is the top two were low-hanging fruit, and this is a little more complex, but really interesting research by James Pennebaker at the University of Texas finds that there's a strong association between pronouns and power. And I don't mean gender pronouns. I mean first-person pronouns, where people who feel like they are disempowered, so maybe they are at a lower level in a hierarchy, maybe they are sick, maybe they're tired, maybe they're depressed, maybe they're younger, maybe they're poorer. People who feel like they have less power, and maybe this connects to the scarcity mindset as well, focus on themselves. They're more self-conscious. And this is, it's displayed with phrases like, I was just thinking, I kind of thought, so I was wondering, I could be wrong, but, and all these preambles that are just kind of hard to listen to. But don't monitor yourself for self-consciousness, because that makes you self-conscious when you're talking, but you can do an email audit, and that's a good way to practice.
So I love the Prince story also, because I think it reminds us about another behavioral science element that's going on here is the power of the growth mindset. Right. And I say this to my kids all the time. They say, oh, I can't do blah, blah. And I say, yet. And they're like, what? So you can't do it yet. And I think that really, that Prince story is so, such a good example of that, right? Like, he's not charismatic at the beginning, but he studies, he's diligent, he observes, and then figures out. And probably like, there's lots of iterations where he tries stuff out and sees how the crowd reacts, right? And learns through doing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love that so simple way to remind people about the growth mindset, to just say yet. And I'm going to borrow that with my daughter. Thank you, Josh.
Awesome. Towards the end of the book, you talk about dreaming big. And I want to make sure I pronounce his name correctly. You have this great anecdote about Balabas Benkrada, is that right? Or close?
Balabas Benkrada.
Nice.
Yeah.
And he has this ambition about figuring out a way to make fair and freer and more above board elections in Tunisia after the Arab Spring. The one thing about that chapter, though, is it seems like there's less hard science in that chapter. And it's not that I'm arguing against dreaming big. I found that I've tried to employ that, and I think it's a very successful strategy. But I'm wondering, is there any science behind this idea of dreaming big in terms of connecting it to influence or just to being more successful?
So that chapter in the book is the reviews chapter. So I'm trying to review the many different strategies and tools and things. So I intentionally kept the science to a minimum in that chapter. But your question about, is there science around dreaming big? It mostly, I believe that this is one of those things that actually doesn't need science, because it just needs logic and experience that you will so rarely get more than you ask for. And so this ties back to just asking. But it also ties to the idea of visionary leadership. And I talk about this in seminars and workshops that I teach sometimes when we're discussing Adam Grant's work on givers and takers and matchers, and how the people at the very top and the people at the very bottom are more likely to be givers. And they're focused on the good that they can do for other people. But if they're not taking care of themselves, it's easy to get taken advantage of and end up at the bottom. But one of the mental shifts that we have to make to be one of the givers at the top, or to be a visionary leader, is to let go of the idea that we need to return every favor, because that keeps us playing small. And in order to play big and dream big, we need to be asking for far more than we can ever repay. And something that ties in here, this is from a very sciencey book, this frame, but I would say it's not specifically science, but from this book by Tara Moore called Playing Big, which I absolutely love. She's writing it for women, but it's applicable for everyone. She writes about good student habits and this idea that we are kept small by our parents, and then especially our teachers, by training us to be good and to just sit back and wait for the gold star and the good grade and the recognition. And I think everyone on the call can relate to this idea that what it takes to succeed in school is very different from what it takes to succeed in life. And if you're not playing big, and if you're not dreaming big, and if you're not asking for far more than you could possibly repay and laying out this grand vision, it's okay. Like, it's really, really totally fine. There's nothing wrong with you as a person. You're just not going to be as influential as you could be.
That explains a lot of why I wasn't very good at school, but I'm doing okay in the real world.
Really?
No, but
you came to Yale, so
yeah,
I'm expecting you did okay.
I did so. But I think that is a really important lesson, because I talk about this again with my kids of school is about a set of hoops that you're supposed to jump through. And fine, maybe you jump through those hoops because you need to get to certain things, but that's not really how life works. Because if it's just your setup, you're basing your effort on some other hoop that someone else has established for you, as opposed to the big dream that you have for yourself, I think is so important.
That's right. And also your parents and your teachers are focused on your own development, and you just don't have forces in the world that are focused on your own development and recognizing you and rewarding you and telling you exactly what it takes. And you're kind of just out there. All of us are just out there without enough bandwidth to focus on each other's development and help each other succeed. So we got to look out for us.
Well, I have a ton more questions, but I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. And this is kind of like a quirky question about the book. you have this convention in the book of having half chapters and then 3/4 chapters. And I would just love to hear, and I think it's another reason why the book is sticky, but I'd love to hear like where that came from, where that idea came from, and why you thought it was a good idea, or if there's any, behavioral science behind it.
So the real reason is just that it was fun for me to write. It's my first book. It's very hard to write a book, and it's much easier to write a half chapter than to write a whole chapter.
Yeah.
And it was fun. And there's only 1 3/4 chapter, and that's the very last one, chapter 9 3/4. And that's an homage to Harry Potter, and Harry Potter fans will know platform 9 3/4 is the portal to the magic kingdom. So the idea is the end of the book is just the beginning of this journey to influence. But the behavioral science behind the half chapters is that we tend to average our experiences. And so the book feels easier to read if we have some short chapters instead of the half chapters would have had to go into the full chapters and end up with longer chapters. So behavioral science is that having smaller, lighter experiences makes people feel that whatever they were doing was more doable, more fun, more engaging. But there's also the reality of books specifically, which is that people tend to read a chapter before bed. And if they are reading this book that has very, very long chapters, it's easy to get bogged down and then never finish it. But if you have chapters that are short enough that they can read a chapter before bed, it helps them move along and finish the book.
Nice. Well, I have to give a star to Mitra, because when we were talking about the book in preparation for this conversation, she identified the Harry Potter 3/4 thing, which I'm not. I haven't read as many Harry Potter books, so I wasn't aware of it. So I just want to say thanks to you. Before we turn to questions, I want to say thanks to you, Zoe, for having this conversation with me and spending time with me. The book is amazing. I really encourage everyone to go out and buy the book, and probably most importantly, to set up an implementation intention to then read the book. So thanks a lot. I'm going to turn now to Mitra, and she's going to feed us any questions that we have from the audience.
Thank you so, so much, Josh. And I want to just mention the man, Belabes Ben Creda, is so inspiring to me that he is now my husband. So that was actually the hardest chapter to write.
Wow, amazing. Great inside information also. So thanks for sharing.
Thank you, Josh.
So just a reminder to everyone who is in the participant group, go ahead and drop your questions into the Q&A box here. We've got about 9 minutes remaining. If you have any questions for Zoe or want to probe a little bit deeper on any of the questions or topics that Josh has brought up, go ahead and drop those in there. I will also say, I'm always a fan of any kind of like deep references to other works in the book. So yes, I was very, very happy to see the Harry Potter reference.
Thank you for finding that. I know a lot of people are like, 9 3, what?
Yes, that was delightful. So while we are waiting for any questions from the audience, I will also take this opportunity to remind everyone that we are recording this session. So you can expect to see a full recording of this program in the coming days. That will be emailed to each of you who have registered for this. So if you want to go back to something that was discussed earlier, or you want to share this with anyone in your life that could benefit from this conversation, we will be sending that to you, as well as Zoe has agreed graciously to share her email address. If anyone thinks of any questions later on, or you want to continue the conversation that way, we'll also be sharing a link to how you can order your own copy of Influence is Your Superpower. I believe it's currently available via Amazon, Audible, Apple Books, Barnes & Noble, and potentially smaller independent bookstores near you. We don't have any questions in the chat yet. I think that's a sign that this was a pretty thorough conversation. Josh, if you...
I don't know what it's a sign of, but I like your interpretation, Mitra.
Framing is important, right? Josh, if there are any questions that you had for Zoe that you didn't get a chance to get to, I think we've got space for a couple more. And oh, there we go. threatening to cut people off sometimes gets them to ask the questions. This is a question from Alexander Wheeler. This is a minor question in Alexander's words. What was the book, Zoe, that you read 4 times?
Oh, let me see if I have a hard copy of it. I think that I have lent it out, so I can't show you the cover, but it's called Scarcity. It's by Sendhil Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir. And definitely okay, there you go. Thank you, Josh. So definitely Sendhil, but was Eldar also one of the original Ideas 42 people?
Yeah, both Eldar, Sendhil,
okay.
and Antoinette Shore are kind of the 3 main core founders of Ideas 42.
This book, Scarcity, is so brilliant, and it will absolutely change the way that you think about inequity in the world. And it'll change the way that you think about people. And the overall message of it is that when we are lacking something that is real or perceived, and it might be lacking money, it might be lacking food, it might be lacking time, or lacking friends, that we go into this scarcity mindset that short circuits a lot of the mental faculties and rational thinking that we want to be able to do. And so we make these predictably imperfect decisions, and we actually perform as though we have a lower IQ than we really do. Yeah, you'll love it.
I will say before we move on to the next question we have in the queue, that Scarcity is also one of the 3 books that we give out to every Ideas 42er. It's that influential and impactful of a read for sure.
Now 4, now 4 books.
Now 4,
It's one of 4 now.
That's amazing.
So we have a question from Melissa Leal, and she is curious about how the idea that hearing our names is important and how that can play out in personal relationships where people primarily use nicknames.
So in the specific paper that I remember that was looking at the neural signature of people's names, they didn't use nicknames and they didn't use last names. They were comparing people's names to other names like celebrities and things like that. So I imagine that it's probably whatever you identify as you, but and that could be a nickname, right? Or it could be your last name. One of the interesting things, though, that I didn't mention is that your partner's name, if you're in a romantic relationship, does the same thing. And that's really weird, right? Your partner's name activates the self-referential parts of your own brain. And to me, this is a sign of that phenomenon that some people talk about that can look like losing themselves in a relationship. And it doesn't have to be all bad, but our identity ends up expanding to the people, or at least the person that we're closest to, even in that particular way.
I wonder if that's true of like other close friends, because I often feel like very excited when great things happen for my other close friends. I feel like I get an almost positive sheen by knowing them or being close to them.
You know what, Josh? I believe that vicarious satisfaction is the key to ultimate happiness. Because if you can be happy for other people, then there is literally no limit to your possibilities for happiness, because you can always have more when other people are succeeding. But about other people's names, I just don't know.
Yeah.
I believe that was one of the things that they tested, but I would have to go back and look.
Yeah.
So we've got another question from Alexander Ruiz. How do isms, including sexism, racism, ageism, et cetera, and the things that we can't control, impact a person's ability to influence? Do these strategies still ring true or help break down barriers?
So if you feel like you are facing sexism, racism, ageism, homophobia, whatever it is that you might be facing, first of all, you might be right. Second of all, it can be very sticky, difficult, challenging to be the person calling it out, it helps a lot if it's someone in that person's in-group who's calling it out, or at least your ally who's calling it out. So the best thing that we can do to fight all of these isms and biases is to be allies for each other rather than expecting everyone to advocate for themselves. And as anyone in positions of power, another thing we can do to try to mitigate bias is to understand that there are big differences in who feels comfortable asking and who feels empowered to ask, and people who are in dominant groups and whatever that situation is have an easier time asking. So we shouldn't make people ask. We should just, when somebody comes to us, like an employee, colleague, someone comes to us asking for something, we should think about who else maybe should have that thing. But the idea that we are that we have these obstacles to influence because of social biases, yes, this is definitely true. And each person can be tremendously influential regardless of the obstacles that you face, but it's difficult for us in different situations for different reasons. And what I would say, one of the biggest things that we can do, the most important thing, is to not try to be influential or to expect that we're going to have backlash or obstacles or not be listened to. I believe that we all need to be, as we try to be influential, also working on activism and trying to change the systems that we're in that have these biases. But the other best things that we can do is just recruit allies. And when we have allies, one of the best things we can do for each other is amplify each other's voices. And that includes even in meetings and even in classes where we just have an agreement that if we are one of the people who's not being listened to as much, or there's a group of us, we are echoing and supporting and then re-engaging with each other's ideas. So this is just, it's like a teeny tiny thing. I would never say that all of these isms don't count, but that the way that we address them is together.
Great, thank you, Zoe. It is a minute after the hour, and I think that that is a pretty powerful note to end on. We do have a few more questions remaining, so if you dropped a question into the chat box and we did not make it to your question live, Zoe's email address is on the screen here. It's zoe.chance@yale.edu. And like I said earlier, she has agreed, to answer any other questions or continue the conversation via email. So please don't hesitate to reach out. If you have lingering questions for anyone at Ideas 42, feel free to reach out to us at info@ideas42.org. Like I said, we are sending a recording of this program around to everyone with this information. So don't feel like you need to rush to copy this down, as well as information to order Influence is Your Superpower. Thank you very much to our Executive Director, Josh Wright, and to our special guest and academic affiliate, Zoe Chance, one more time. And thanks to all of you still on the line for spending an hour with us at the Ideas 42 Academy.
Josh, thank you so much. It was a pleasure talking with you. Mitra, thank you for moderating. And Anthony, thank you for helping us get this all going. Great to meet you virtually, everybody. Appreciate your time.
Thanks so much, Zoe.